welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Yad Darris.
Hello, hello.
Wait, what? We're back to this? Why
Yeah,
is Sam first
Sam gets
again?
second billing.
Okay, fine.
He's the meat in the sandwich.
Mm.
Today we are discussing the second book in our Obsession series with Sabato's The Tunnel. If this is your first time, join our book club on Reddit at Canonical Pod. You can find that in the link in our episode description, and you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod. If you would like to support us in your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is also in our episode description. In this episode, we will be revealing spoilers, but this book doesn't really have spoilers, so I think you're safe, even if you didn't read the book. We did put out a review last week. If you want to listen to a review of this book, you can find that in our archive. Next week, we will review our last book for this series on obsession. That will be The Limeworks by Thomas Bernhard. In the last episode, the review, we talked about how this book was pretty simple in that it was essentially a psychological study of a single character. In this case, it's Castell, a misanthropic killer. So while the description of a disturbed mind can be thrilling and has a long history in fiction, a book that is laser focused on an abnormal character limits what a reader can take away from a novel. So what do you think? Is there anything more to The Tunnel than this kind of psychological study?
This is kind of what I said last time, isn't it? If we just see Castell and we think it's just him, there's not much more. But I think that Sabato intends for us to look at Castell and see something of ourselves.
Do you see something of yourself in here?
I do.
The murdering?
Yeah, I mean, don't tell anybody, but yeah. But just the jealousy, the mistrust, I think that there is something. Obviously, it's taken to an extreme in this novel, but there is something in Castell that I think most readers, if they're honest, can find in themselves.
Yeah, I agree. Not so much the jealousy, but the alienation. There are things that he said and felt that reminded me of a lot of like teenage angst and depression, even though obviously I'm not a teenager anymore, and as far as I know, I didn't kill anyone back then. But there are moments where he touches on these things and he almost gleans something meaningful, the character, I should say, before he turns away from that meaning and delves into a strange conclusion.
I mean, James, should we assume from your question that when you read this novel, you don't see a little Castell inside of you?
I think, yes, that the negative attributes present in Castell, negative in that it's unhealthy, is present in everyone, so it's universal. But I guess what I'm getting at here is we have criticized a lot of books for being very light on ideas, and most recently in the 3 Chinese science fiction books, which actually I think have more ideas than in this book. I think this book is actually quite light on ideas, and I'm wondering, why we aren't talking about it in that context. Why is it that we are not saying this book is light on ideas? Do you think this novel is saying anything about the human condition or art, since he's a painter?
This is kind of getting into where I wanted to go with talking about art. I've been struggling with that. I think it's important that he's a painter. The art itself, I think that's a vehicle for this. I think that's a vehicle for other discussions that are happening in the book. But the human condition, sort of, I mean, just echoing what Ian and I have already been saying, that this is taking some universal feelings, universal thoughts, and taking them to a very unhealthy extreme.
Just to prosecute this a bit more, I believe we were on record perhaps, Iad, you more on record than the two of us in discussing Vagabonds, in saying that ideas are cheap, that it is not enough in that book to talk about, for example, the feeling of being lost, of indecision, that there needs to be more than just that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I see that here as well, that he's obviously talking about obsession, unhealthy male obsession, jealousy, but is it anything more than just presenting it? I don't know. I don't see it.
What you're missing is that this is 25% of the length of Vagabonds.
Yeah. Still, I mean, if we're saying that it is enough here to just present it, but we're saying it's not enough in other books to just present it, that we expect more to be done with it, are we being unfair in some situations, or are we giving this book too much credit because it's written by someone that is already in the canon and that the novel is better written than the other book?
Well, to answer that question, there is, I think, whenever we look back from such a long distance, an aura of meaning around a book that has survived for so long. And we're inclined to judge the book not in itself, but by its reception from other readers who we respect. In this case, I think the acceptance of the novel by Camus is very significant, especially because this novel invites so many comparisons to The Stranger. And you've said many times you haven't read The Stranger, but here I think it's enough to just say that the form is the same and the subject matter is the same. You have a killer speaking from prison, looking back on his crimes. But what I think The Stranger does much more than The Tunnel is that it heightens the existential themes. It develops the themes much more than The Tunnel does. So to answer your first question, yes, this is not as developed as we might like it to be. And in the sense that we could criticize Vagabonds for being light on ideas, we could also criticize The Tunnel. But the reason why I don't is specifically because the ideas in The Tunnel are so central to humanity. This feeling of being disconnected from other people and this feeling of being limited, of not experiencing the total freedom that I think an existentialist would say we are born with, and we are being limited by the judgment and the considerations of other people. I think that is important to me as a reader, and I think it's an important thing to human beings in general. And even though it's not well developed, because I see enough of a hint of it in this novel, I'm giving it more credit than maybe I should.
I did not know about Camus' recommendation of this novel before I read the book, so that didn't really play any role in my valuation of it. I didn't read the introduction or the foreword to this book before reading it. But I think what makes this book better, obviously, and this is a point I made in Vagabonds, is the writing is much better. And because the writing is better, especially in a book where you don't have a lot of ideas, the writing really needs to be good. So much depends on how the prose works and how the reader is carried along. It's not so much the length for me as it is the prose. I think the prose creates that tension that I mentioned in the review. And because of that tension, there is complexity.
I would not call this a beautiful book the way we were talking about Nabokov, but it's still very well written. It is short, but I never was bored by it or anything, and that didn't even cross my mind. It is compelling in a way. There is a curiosity that leads you on, and I did want to understand him, even though that understanding is what we've been talking about. Is he actually looking for understanding?
I mean, if you read Vagabonds and it came with an introduction by a respected novelist and it was written 70 years ago, would you react to it in the same way? I would say no. I think that all of these extra textual things establish such a strong context for your reception that it's very difficult for a reader to resist.
This is kind of getting off the beaten path a little bit, but I read that Vagabonds was propped up a bit by Liu Cixin. I only learned that recently, well after reading Vagabonds. He's obviously not as heavy of a hitter as Camus, but that certainly doesn't sway any opinion. Does that matter? Does his word matter enough?
For me, I did not read this book with any foreknowledge of like Camus' recommendation or Sabato's standing in the canon. I knew none of that when I read this book. I didn't know who Sabato was. I mean, I knew nothing because this was just recommended by you, Sam. I came to it with no extra textual knowledge at all. And I did leave it thinking that it was light. The complexity for me did not come from the ideas in the book. It came from the way it was structured and the writing. And I did not as heavily critique the other books for being light on ideas. I thought they were fine. So I'm not really criticizing this book too much for being light on ideas, but I am pointing out that it is light on ideas. And I think it sounds like we all agree that when it comes to, for example, juxtaposing it with Pale Fire, which we just read, like this isn't even in the same ballpark, right? Like it doesn't make you think the same way that Pale Fire does.
I'm going to throw this question back at you. Do you think this is saying something about the human condition or art?
I don't know. I think I'm really mixed on this, which is why I'm asking the question. I think Sabato wants to do it, but there is definitely not enough evidence here for me to say definitively that he's saying anything more than the fact that people feel alienated. And here's an extreme version of alienation, which to me is very simplistic and at this time cliched. It's a very cliched sentiment.
Here I'm going to continue. I feel like my ideas have been kind of running at a tangent to both of your ideas, but I do feel like the context surrounding this novel is significant. Whether or not you're aware of the context when you're reading or before you're reading, I do think that it's possible for a writer, not every writer, but for some writers, to write deliberately novels that are meant to be part of a context, and other writers to write works that stand alone outside of a particular milieu. The reason why I think this is significant is that I think that The Tunnel definitely belongs to this canon of existential literature that I mentioned in the previous episode. I think it's significant. I did a little bit of research. Sartre's novel Nausea was published in 1938, and then his long existentialist tract Being and Nothingness was published in 1942. His most famous play No Exit was published in 1944. Camus' The Stranger is published in 1942. And then finally, The Tunnel is published in 1948. So within the span of 10 years, we have pretty much the most famous and most influential texts in existentialism being published one after the other. So I do think it wouldn't be too much of a leap to say that this novel is significant, particularly because it seems to belong very thoroughly to a zeitgeist, a existentialist spirit that was kind of taking over Europe's mind in the late 30s and 1940s. And that, to me, I don't know if it's something that we can give credit to Sabato, but I do think that it does influence our reception of this novel.
I want to go back to James, your question about what is he saying about art. I think there's something significant here. Not so much art directly, but why do you think Castell is a painter specifically? Is this novel saying something about the creative mind? Why do you think Castell is a visual artist rather than, say, a writer or a musician?
I do think it's very significant. I think, James, you had said that it might not be significant, but I do think it's meaningful that he is a painter. I do think it's important that he is a writer, just in terms of a creative artist being a professional expresser of feelings, a professional of taking the interiority of human experience and sharing it with other people in some way. And I think that it shows that he is in a position where he's trying to connect with other people in some way and failing.
I agree, but I was looking specifically. There's a lot of visual imagery in this. He talks about blindness quite a bit, for example. And I think that really goes to the idea of understanding, what understanding is supposed to mean. He sees blindness as a weakness. For example, Allende, Maria's husband, is blind, and he's treated as this feeble-minded simpleton, even though that's a very simple way of looking at him and his relationship with Maria. In fact, I alluded to this before. I don't think Castell ever really tries to understand Maria. He demands understanding of him, but he never really tries to know Maria's true self or her life or where she's coming from, or even what's important to her. There's a scene in the middle of the book where he makes Maria meet him at a park, and he's demanding all these things of her, and it's getting dark because it's night out, and he keeps insisting on certain questions, and he wants to see her face, so he lights a match, and he thinks that he gets some sort of understanding from seeing her, but the most touching moments in that scene happen when the match goes out. She touches his face to kind of calm him down and connect with him in a real way. But he rejects that. He only wants to believe what he can see. I think that's an important facet of his being a painter, is that he thinks that visual confirmation is all that matters, when really that's a surface level thing.
I think you're right. I hadn't made the connection between him being a visual artist and his views towards blindness, but I do think that you could push this interpretation one step further. It seems to me that Sabato has something to say in general about the success of art as a way of connecting with other people. I think that Castell's biggest problem is his inability to connect with other people, and he tries to use his art to connect with Maria, and it turns out to be very unsuccessful. Do you think that Sabato thinks that art can actually help people to understand each other and connect with other people?
I think that's a tricky question because if we're looking through Castell, he thinks that everyone is a phony. He thinks that all the art critics and other painters are just fools who think a lot of themselves and don't see the truth. So I don't really know how we're supposed to take that as, I don't know how we're supposed to take art as this great medium for connection. We even get that discussion in the middle when he goes to the estancia, that conversation between Hunter and Mimi about novels. I think it's specifically mystery novels. And I guess they're having a connection, even though they don't see eye to eye. But we're looking through Castell, and all we see is him rolling his eyes at this, what he thinks is an inane conversation.
What I would say to kind of bolster my interpretation is that I think, yes, you're right that art is not significant in terms of him connecting with other people, because when other people appreciate his art, he doesn't respond well to it. When the critics appreciate his art, he doesn't respond well to it. And when he sees people talking about novels, he thinks they're ridiculous. But he sees Maria interpreting his painting and thinking that this particular part of his painting is so important, yet that's not enough for him to form a meaningful connection with her. This reminds me about my own life. As a younger man, I used to think, quite stupidly, I now realize, that if I could meet somebody who liked art and understood art in the same way that I do, that would be a soulmate, or that would be a person who would really understand me. And I think this isn't me particularly, but a lot of people have this attitude that understanding art in the same way means that people are kindred spirits. And I think what Sabato is saying in this novel is that that's not true, because even though two people can understand art in the same way, it doesn't mean that they have any meaningful connection. In the climax of the novel, you have Castell talking about how he thought that he had been living in this tunnel all of his life, and he could see through the glass walls of the tunnel from times and see Maria in another separate tunnel, and they were moving together towards some other place. But then later in the novel, he realizes, no, I had been in one tunnel my entire life, and it was a solitary tunnel that belonged only to me. So I think this kind of illusion of connection with other people that's brought about by art is something that Sabato wants us to note. I think that perhaps not visual art specifically, but maybe the visual art specifically, are seen as a very shallow way of connecting with other people. And there's something much more important, because it is also noticeable, to me at least, that Allende seems to have a healthy relationship with Maria. And Hunter also seems to have a healthy relationship with Maria, even though they have no deep artistic connection of the sort that Castell seems to want.
It's interesting. I looked at that section when he's talking about the tunnel, and the big thing I pulled from that was about depression, what depression feels like. It felt very real to me. It felt like a very accurate description of what depression feels like. And I remember thinking much along those lines as a teenager, and then coming sort of to a similar realization that he did, except that he seems to stop and not think much deeper about it, about that isolation. He seems to reach that conclusion that he's been in this tunnel, and that's all he does with it. When really, I think part of the problem with depression is that you can't see beyond that tunnel. And that tunnel is constructed by the person. That's part of the problem. That's part of why it's difficult to get out of that tunnel. But it struck me as interesting that he never really does get beyond that. What that says about art, I don't know. I think you're right about how maybe Sabato is saying something about that just understanding art in the same way doesn't mean a whole lot.
Well, let's try to push it a little bit further. I mean, when he leaves his apartment with the intent to kill Maria, he takes the painting that she had looked at, Maternidad, Maternity, and he destroys it. Why does he destroy the painting?
I was about to ask you the same thing, actually. I took it as the literal, that he was frustrated with it and he saw it as this symbol of a false connection. But yeah, I guess you could extrapolate that to mean that you shouldn't take those things so seriously, that there is more to life than what you share with a single painting.
Honestly, anything I'll say is just me agreeing with you guys. So my only question, and here's the thing, is I didn't want to jump in, is because my question would be, it sounds like we are reading a moral into this story that I am not comfortable with. I do not see the moral in this story. I am comfortable with like everything else, but I won't take that last step and say this is the moral, that this is what he's saying about art, because I don't think he is. I don't think there's enough evidence for it.
Maybe instead of thinking of it as a moral, I just tend to think of it as an observation about the way humans think about art and expression, that if they could express something in the right way, and if other people could interpret it in the right way, then they would understand each other. And that, I think, is the thing that Sabato is probably pushing against. I don't know if he really wants us to stop going to museums or to stop caring about art, but it shows to me, at least as a reader, that art might not be as powerful as we might want it to be. I think that Castell feels the same way when he destroys the painting. The title of the painting is Maternity, and the part of the painting that I think he thinks is important and Maria thinks is important is a woman looking through a window. Uh, I think it's significant. This is a kind of criticism that I don't really enjoy. I don't really like digging for symbols, but you could say that maternity is the time in our lives when we actually have a sincere connection to another person, just because we're physically connected to our mothers. But I do think that he looks at this painting as a false door from his tunnel to another tunnel. And he realizes that there are no real doors from his tunnel. There's no way out. And he wants to spare himself the potential for any future disappointment by letting anybody else see that door and to try to get into his tunnel. He's already experienced the horror of that disappointment, and he's sparing himself, he's saving himself. That to me, I think, is the reason why he destroys the painting.
I know you don't like this yet, but perhaps it's meaningful that this woman is in a window, not a door,
Yeah,
in the painting, because it's something you can see. It's a window and not a door.
yeah, you can look through it, but you can't pass through it, I suppose. That might be meaningful. I don't know why. I just feel like this kind of criticism or this kind of analysis it just irritates me. I don't like people who really dig for symbols. I don't know why.
I think actually he might say the same thing, Sabato, but he does talk about windows in the tunnel the same way.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can escape it when you're reading fiction from this time period, especially when it's a period of time, and he references all these psychoanalysts, right? Like these Freudian, I don't remember what he calls them or what it's translated into, but this looking for symbolism that he skewers it. But I think at that time period, you can't really escape it.
Yeah. I mean, it would be very contrary to the spirit of existentialism to say that everybody is controlled by these same three parts of the mind and that people have the same drives. I think that it would be very, very antithetical to the ideas of existentialism to believe in psychoanalysis. That's not particularly the reason why I don't like searching for symbols. I just think that it's kind of hokey. I don't have a really good reason why. So, in the novel, as we had mentioned, a lot of the novel gives us a view of Castell's rationalizations for his jealousy. And there is a profound sense of irony in the tension between the lucidity of his thinking and the irrationality of his behavior. What is that irony for? Is there some sort of message or something that Sabato wants to say about rationality?
I saw it as an analytical mind isn't the end all be all that we sometimes claim it is. That rationale, when it leads to poor conclusions, such as that Maria must obviously be sleeping with Hunter, is obviously flawed and not worthy of praise. Even though Castell, thinks that that rationale is paramount, that that's very important to him and his way of seeing the world. Overthinking does not equal rationality. That was one of the things I really struggled with in this book, because I think it does give a very accurate portrayal of depression, but the book's job is not to solve depression or to offer even an escape from this kind of overthinking or irrationality mixed with poor logic.
I think you can maybe link this kind of rationality or this reliance on logic to your earlier comment on psychoanalysis and how it gives you this false knowledge, right? Because that's how psychoanalysis works. This equals that. And that's how his mind works, despite him looking down on all these psychiatrists or psychologists. To your answer your question, you're saying, does this have something to say about rationality? I think that's why Sabato is doing this. Because in this book, I think he focuses on false reasoning, on how Castell presents these steps as being true, that this must logically lead to this. And the way he talks about it is this is the only solution, this is the real answer. But I think what Sabato is saying is that no, like Castell is obviously misguided in that there is more than one answer or reason for why someone does something. But Castell is very confident that his interpretation is the correct one. I see that as similar to your earlier comment about psychoanalysis, that when he skewers these psychologists or psychiatrists, never know, psychotherapists, I don't know what they were called at that time, what he skewers them for is this, the fact that they can claim some kind of knowledge by interpreting symbols. And to me, this is the tension, is that Castell thinks he can interpret these symbols or these actions correctly, but we don't know. He probably is not interpreting them correctly.
You might say he has tunnel vision.
One might, yeah.
Yeah, one might. Not me.
Do you think that there is a relationship between Maria and Hunter? I don't think there's enough evidence of one, given what's presented to us.
I don't think there is either. But it almost doesn't matter.
I did read reviews where they said that some readers did interpret it as a relationship. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter in a way, because that's not the main thrust of the novel. But I think, it's left open for interpretation for a reason, right? It's left open for us to interpret. Whereas Castell is so certain that there is a relationship.
He already knows that she's sleeping with Allende. Like, he already knows that she's not faithful. So one more man seems to be irrelevant.
I feel like, in a sort of swinging situation, you do have to keep track of who's coming and going, as it were.
I guess, but that goes to his not understanding of who she is as a whole person. He seems to think that she can't love anyone except a single person, and he wants it to be him. But that's not how love works always, and that's certainly not the way she works. Even without bringing swinging into it, it's not even the way he works. I mean, he goes out and sleeps with other people and then gets mad at them for reminding him of Maria.
We've all done that. Hired the flooziest whore in the bar.
In his mind, he knows when he's sleeping with these prostitutes, he's not forming a connection between tunnels. Oh, God. That could be read the wrong way. He knows he's not having the same connection with them as he is with Maria.
So that makes it okay?
Well, I think because he's so introverted, when he looks at Maria with Hunter, he imagines that Maria and Hunter are as close to each other as she is to him, or Maria is as close to Allende as she is to him. And that, to me, I think is what bothers him. It's not necessarily the physical intimacy, but the emotional intimacy that bothers him.
He doesn't ask the right questions. He never asks the nature of her love. He never asks...
He does. He interrogates her.
He interrogates her, but he doesn't... It's not out of curiosity. It's not from wanting to understand her. It's from wanting to trap her.
I think, again, this is the limits of rationality. You can ask a series of questions that lead one into the other, and you can think that you're getting somewhere, but if you've started down the wrong path, you're never going to get onto the right path. At the end of the novel, he goes to Allende's house, and he tells Allende what he's done, and Allende responds like, "Oh, you fool, you fool." Why does he respond that way?
It's funny. I was going to ask you that too.
Why does he say that? Like, he's not angry. He's responding like, "Oh, you're so stupid, like you've missed something." What is it that Castell's rational mind has missed?
I think he is angry, but it's also that he's calling out Castell's stupidity. I think part of it is that he is simple, that he's looking at love as this one-to-one relationship, and that's all it can ever be. You can only love one person, and that love, when I say love, it means the exact same thing as when you say love.
Yeah. I think it establishes some of the stakes that have been at play throughout the novel, because I think that connection with another person, a serious, lasting connection, is important. It's one of the main important things in this novel. And rationality has prevented that. And one of the ways that actual connection could have been made is by being less introverted and speaking with other people more honestly about it. It's kind of like when you are overthinking things and you're too inside yourself, and then you miss something really obvious. And then when somebody else takes a look at the same situation, well, it's very clear to them at that moment, "Oh, well, this is what you should do." I think that's why at the end of the novel, Allende says, "Oh, you fool," because in this kind of interpersonal relationship that two people can have, it becomes very clear what's gone wrong. And the rationality that one person has on his own will never be able to see it.
He wants to find the single answer at the end. He doesn't care about nuance, he doesn't care about complexities.
He doesn't have a friend. He doesn't have anybody to talk to about Maria besides Maria. Like, this friend at the end of the novel who magically appears to loan him a car is just that. He's just a person with a car. It just shows that having somebody to talk to is so important to people.
All right, well, I need a break from you guys. So when we come back, we'll talk about whether or not this book feels out of place now that we're reading it in 2021. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. So this book was published in 1948 and made quite an impact, but maybe it doesn't really have that impact now that we're reading it in 2021. Do you think there is anything timeless about this novel?
I think the things that Iad talked about earlier in this episode and in our review, those feelings of isolation, I think even what we were talking about just before the break about the problems with looking at things only from this analytical one track way. I think those are timeless issues.
I think my reading is swayed by the way I think Sabato must have felt about this novel. I think that when Sabato wrote this novel, I think that there was something about human beings in general that we were supposed to see in Castell. The evolution of modern values in modern readers is that nowadays we realize that the white male perspective is not the quote unquote human perspective. And to that end, I think that for a lot of readers, this will be very emblematic of another time. Having said that, I do think that there is a lot of human truth in Castell, and there's a lot of human truth in this novel, but it's not comprehensive truth. It's very specific to one type of person, but for that type of person, it's very meaningful and substantial.
Well, part of that problem, too, is that there is some universal things in here, but because they're couched behind this violent, toxic masculine guy, a lot of that messaging gets lost or can get lost very easily. It makes it really easy to dismiss in 2021 because he's a terrible character. He's a terrible person. And it's very easy to see that and not see what the point of the book might be, what we've just been talking about.
I agree with both of you here, but also, yeah, you outlined how this was in the heyday of existentialism. I just don't think people think in this way now. And it's harder to appreciate it for that reason. I think when you have a novel, as you said earlier, Yed, that is so much of a tradition that when that tradition passes, it becomes dated. So there are timeless elements of it in that any novel can be timeless. If you pull out any segment of an idea, it can be timeless. I don't think that this novel is particularly timeless. For me, it feels quite dated. What is timeless to me is the way it's written. I think the prose, with how clean it is, and the story that's told here, I think that is timeless. If you're reading it as a kind of a thriller, I think you would still get something out of it because the story is well told. I'm not sure whether or not the atmosphere or the feeling of this book is as timeless.
It's interesting you note the clean prose in the novel. It's significant to me that Sabato is actually trained as a physicist. I found this essay online by Sabato talking about his childhood, and he said that when he was young, he was very introverted and he was always scrutinizing his ideas and his presumptions and his feelings. It made him very uncomfortable. But then his math teacher demonstrated a theorem in geometry for the first time, and he had a revelation. He says he began to discover the charms of the Platonic universe, a perfect order of ideal objects, eternal and untrammeled. So I think that this kind of background in math and physics is significant in his prose style. I just think in general, there's probably a lot more to say about Sabato and his background as a physicist in terms of his understanding of people and his work as a writer later in life.
Reading this and learning a little bit about him has very little to do with the tunnel specifically, but it did make me want to read more into Argentina's past and that Sabato report, Nunca Más, that I mentioned in the intro in our review. I don't know a lot about that era, the 1960s, 1970s. But I know that this was a turbulent time in Latin America and specifically in Argentina. And the fact that this condemning report that he was such a big part of is still called the Sabato Report. I couldn't find anything about the tunnel without seeing things about it. And it makes me curious about his other writing.
Well, do you want to read more of his fiction?
I think so. I actually saw more people praising some of his later work, that there were similar themes, but that they were better written than the tunnel, even though the tunnel is considered by many to be his masterpiece. I get the sense that it's kind of like Camus, that The Stranger is considered his masterpiece when really there are other works that might be better.
Okay, let's conclude now. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will review The Lime Works by Thomas Bernhard, our last book for the series on obsession. We've also got an updated reading schedule, which you can find on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we post threads for our book club discussion every Friday. If you would like to talk about the topics we just discussed, or about this series in general, you can find us there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.